live in the UK, and in autumn, it gets dark at around 4 p.m. There was a school autumn break that week, so all the kids were at home, so that means my girlfriend's brother was home too. I'd been with her for about a year at that point, so her family knew me pretty well, and her brother enjoyed my company. She'd recently been pretty stressed out. Her parents were going out across the country for the day, so she had to look after her brother. But I thought that I'd give her a day to herself so she can just cool off. I asked her parents if I could look after their son for the day instead, and they agreed. So I came in around 8 a.m. and they let me in before they set off. My girlfriend's brother woke up about an hour later and she followed shortly afterwards. We went out for breakfast at a local cafe together and went back to our house when we were done, and once I dropped her off, I took her brother to the park. We got there at about 2 p.m. and the place was pretty packed. Eventually the sun started going down and the place was completely empty by 4 p.m. I texted my girlfriend and told her that we'd be home in a bit, and she said okay. I'm gonna be honest, I completely lost track of time. Me and her brother were having fun being the only two in the park. Me and her brother were stood on top of this really tall climbing frame with a slide on it. It was almost pitch black at this point, so I was using my phone as a flashlight. A notification popped up on my screen, and it was my girlfriend asking where we were. I responded, "Oops, coming home now," and told her brother that we had to go. He sighed and asked if we could go down the slide, and I said yes. Before I went down, I knew what the park looked like. There were streetlights all around it, benches everywhere, some trees, and places for the kids to play. When I came out of the slide, there was something weird. A man had appeared out of nowhere and was stood beneath one of the streetlights. He had a trench coat on and a beanie hat. I immediately got my girlfriend's brother behind me and called out to the man with a friendly, "Hi there." I got a response. I guess he started groaning. I noticed he was swaying back and forth in the light and had his mouth open, drooling with a blank look in his eyes. This man made me feel really uneasy, and I picked the little brother up and kept checking on this guy the entire time. There was an exit to my left that led to the path back home, so I left out that way and kept checking behind me every few seconds. The guy was still stood there. The path where the guy was stood merges with a big main path if you walk out through some bushes, and so does the one I walked through. I was walking down the path for about 2 minutes, periodically checking behind me, and thought that I was in the clear. I wasn't. I was on a straight stretch of path with lots of streetlights when I saw him again. He was stood beneath one, looking up at it, and he was playing with something in his hands. I looked closer and realized that it was a knife. I kept walking and walking, checking behind me constantly. Girlfriend's little brother was so scared that he had his head tucked into my chest. I noticed that the guy seemed to be moving to new streetlights whenever I turned around. Initially, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but I started counting them and realized 2 streetlights behind him had definitely turned into 5. I could faintly hear the groaning noise, and he was occasionally moaning as well. I picked up the pace a bit and turned a corner, getting into the last stretch of street before I got to my girlfriend's house. That was when I heard him behind the row of bushes. That moaning noise sounded angry, and I heard his heavy footsteps bounding down the path. The man was running. I immediately broke into a sprint and didn't stop until I turned an alleyway at the front of the street and got behind my girlfriend's house. There's a big bush there, so I crouched down behind that and spammed her phone with messages to open the back gate. I hugged her brother close until she opened it for us and got us in quickly. It felt like years. I went to the front of the house and had it confirmed that I'd managed to shake him. He was now in the street, circling where I'd been outside of the alleyway just moments ago. He was still moaning. He had that knife in his hand. He started kicking people's bins over, and I called the police immediately, but he was gone by the time they arrived, and as far as I know, they never found him. There was a similar incident near the area a few months ago that I saw in a local Facebook group, but I don't think anything came of that either. Her parents thanked me for keeping their son safe and didn't hold any ill will against me for the situation. He went back to normal pretty much the days afterwards, but he still has nightmares about the event. When my country isn't in lockdown, I'm still allowed to look after him with my girlfriend, funnily enough, but we haven't been back to that park ever since, and I still check over my shoulder and break into a cold sweat every time I'm alone in the street. So this happened about 10 years ago in Manitou Springs, Colorado. I was living in a friend's trailer on her couch, and there was very limited space, and I was looking for a place of my own. I ran into this guy that lived a few trailers down from her, and he was telling me that he was looking out to rent part of his trailer, so I went over to take a look. This guy seemed really off, in a creepy sort of way, but at the time, I was really desperate to give my friend her living room couch back and get out of there, so I was willing to go pretty much anywhere. When I went over there, he told me that he'd rent out a small space inside of this ridiculously small trailer, or he was willing to rent out a small cubby that he had underneath his trailer that he also showed to me. It looked like to be about 10 by 10 crawl space under his trailer. This alone should have been the red flag that made me turn him down flat, but like I said, I was pretty desperate, and that red flag was one of many to come. So I hesitantly and very reluctantly agreed to rent this small space inside and move my stuff over that night. Almost immediately, he started going on about a curfew I'd have to abide by if I was to live there, and a bunch of other nonsense that I wasn't about to sit and listen to, so I left. When I came back, I found him sprawled out on his front porch, mumbling about how he'd just taken a bunch of pills and holding a half-empty bottle of booze in his hand. I had to step over him to get in the door as he began screaming about how I hadn't minded his warning about my new curfew. At this point, I flat out told him that if I was going to be paying him money to stay there, I would be coming and going as I pleased, since I'm an adult, not a child, and certainly not his child. To this, he reacted by having quite the outburst of rage, at which point I was sure that this was not going to work. He then gets up and starts flinging my stuff out into the street, and this is all happening at like 2 a.m. So I gather what belongings are still left in his house and take them outside with me while I continue to gather what he's already thrown out and go begging my friend to let me come back into her trailer. And she let me, but that's not where this bizarre story ends. A few days after this happens, I see a young girl at his house and they're both getting drunk, and I didn't think much of it. But about a week after that, once I had found another place to stay, my friend that lived in that trailer park called me, panicking, asking if I was okay. After I got her to calm down some and assured her that I was fine, I asked her what made her even ask to begin with. She tells me that they had just pulled a human body from the little cubby under that guy's trailer that had been there for several days. She told me that the guy that lived there had been arrested for trying to rob a convenience store with a machete, and the girl's body he had stashed under his trailer had begun to smell, so the landlord called the police. The young girl I had seen him drinking with just a few days beforehand was found wrapped in a quilt under his trailer. All that was running through my mind as she was telling me all of this was that would have been me had I not left when I did. I didn't step foot in that trailer park again. Even going anywhere near it gave me the creeps so bad I couldn't stand the thought of going anywhere close for years afterwards. And as badly as I felt for that young girl, I was still very thankful that I walked away from there with my life. Before I start telling the story, I have to say that this happened over 3.5 years ago when I was between the ages of 15 and 18. All the people in this story have been changed for privacy reasons. I grew up in a pretty good-sized town. High school grades always between 800 and 1,000 students. The town was about 45 minutes to an hour from the second biggest city in the state, which is known for 3 rivers and many bridges. I have 2 older brothers, which means obviously I am the youngest of 3 boys. Our mother was the general manager at my grandpa's golf course. By no means were we well off in any way, but we were far from poor, and our father was in the state police, a lieutenant at the time of everything happening. Cop Dad was hard on us when needed, but We all three learned to always be respectful no matter what, unless extreme situations call for not being it. I will say that due to a very dark history, I've never had a close relationship with all of my brothers or parents. Even with all of that, I'll admit this made my dad and I be slightly close even for very short periods of time, and that we only had one thing in common, that we'd each protect the ones we love at all costs, even if it meant our lives. Him with my mom and family, and I with my girlfriend and nieces and nephew. When I was 15, I went to the downtown area to get food and ice cream with friends at a place about half a mile from our high school football stadium. Being that we were only 15 years old, going into our 10th grade year of high school and almost 16, we all rode our bikes to meet up. My hometown was split up into 6 wards. The restaurant was 1 to 2 miles away, and I lived in the first ward. When we came back outside to leave to do something else, I realized that my bike was missing. As soon as the group and I checked the immediate area, I called my dad knowing that he was home from work, and he flew down to where I was. We all figured that he'd be livid at us, which he wasn't at all. All of my friends got on their bikes to go off in different directions towards their homes to look for the bike. As my dad and I were driving towards the part of town we lived in, we saw a group of 3, 2 males, 1 female, walking down a side street towards the street we were on, 1.5 miles from the restaurant. The group was pushing my bike as they walked, causing me to snap to attention and say loudly, "They have my bike." My dad stopped immediately and put the car in park in the street. We jumped out and I laughed inside due to seeing my dad go from usual to cop dad. Well, he had the girl and one guy stand at the wall with their faces touching it, and he slammed the guy with the bike to the ground. I grabbed the bike and put it in the bed of the truck. Since it was only 2 of us against 3, my dad told me to get in the truck so they don't see your face, and I said, "Screw that." And it wasn't until years later that I came to regret that. The cops came and arrested all 3 of them. Now fast forward 2.5 years later, I was 18 years old and home from my freshman year of college, which was spent at a military college across the state from home, which stuff I learned during my time at school will help out. I was out jogging at around 6 p.m. one night on the sidewalk next to the road when a car flew past me, sat at the stop sign until I passed them. Luckily, I was close to home and memorized the car's details, or as much as I could. The vehicle drove and went a lot slower, and I walked into the house when they were passing. I didn't think anything was wrong with the situation other than someone driving fast and slowing down upon realizing someone was jogging. Fast forward 1 week and I just finished up another jog, walked into the house through the front door which leads right into the kitchen, which has a big window that looks out to the driveway, front yard, the street, and stop sign. As soon as I walked to the sink by the window to splash some cold water on my face, I heard a loud boom from outside, sounding like an M80 exploding, then 1 second of silence, then 3 loud booms in quick succession, which, thanks to being a hunter, I knew was gunfire. I dropped down, crawled to the door, grabbed the baseball bat my brother and I used before, and ran out at the door, even though I knew a bat had 0 chance of winning against a firearm, but I was hoping that I'd surprise them. When I got outside, they were driving away, and I recognized the vehicle from a week earlier that sat at the stop sign when I was out jogging. Thankfully, no one was at home at the time, since who knows where they'd be standing or what would happen. After the police came, I had given my statement, and we waited. Since the town was big for a town, it was also small enough that a lot of people knew everyone. The town's police and my brothers all joked with me, asking things like, "Did you try being a hero when no one was around?" Or would ask if I was crazy due to running outside towards gunfire without a gun. Well, 2 or 3 days had passed when we had received the call from the cops saying that they had caught the guy who shot the house. As it turns out, it was the same guy who stole my bike 2.5 years earlier. After finding that out, my dad and I looked at each other without saying anything. We didn't tell my mom about it, being the same guy, and that he had seen me finish up and walk into the house, luckily by chance. The guy had received 10 years for attempted murder with a weapon, attempted assault, but Due to not a single person being injured in any way, no assault charges of any kind were charged towards him. So, we went on with our lives, and I became an EMT during college, working on weekends, then finished school. When I was 26 years old, I had stopped by my parents' house when I was in the area. I walked into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table was the town's newspaper, which the front page read something along the lines of "Local woman missing, vehicle found abandoned and burned." As I started reading the article for a second, I almost immediately ripped the kitchen table off the frame with rage. The article said the missing woman's boyfriend for some period of the time was the same guy who had stolen my bike and shot at my parents' house with me in the front window. He wasn't arrested or charged with any crime related to the missing woman at the time. I left and went back to my apartment an hour away and made sure I was always carrying a pistol, except when I was working on the ambulance. Even through all of the rage that I was feeling, somewhat paranoid thoughts entered my mind, maybe about him following me, even if it was still unlikely. My parents left their house for a week to stay at my grandparents' house, which was empty due to him living at the golf course. Life went on from there. I still work as an EMT in the second biggest city in my state. The guy who shot at my house is currently in prison on charges of crimes not related to the murder of the lady in my hometown. This just happened a few hours ago. My house is on the very edge of town, right before a large wooded area. We do have neighbors. There are 6 apartments in total and some houses across the street. But it was around 11 p.m. and at that time, most of them are usually asleep or sitting in front of their TV, or both. I went out to take my dog on a walk and noticed a bike leaning against the wall in the driveway. It seemed odd since there's a bike rack behind the house, but I didn't really think much of it and went on. When I came back, the bike was still there. Now, there are about walls to both sides of the driveway, about 5 feet tall at the highest point right behind the gate. So I looked up the wall to my left, right into the cold, dead stare of a woman crouching on the wall. Scared, I just kind of stared back for a second. I'd never seen this woman before. She didn't move whatsoever. My dog seemed almost rather confused and scared at the same time. I just kept walking to the door but never took my eyes off of her. Once we were past her, she jumped off the wall and started following us. At that point, my dog, a pretty big Doberman mix, began barking and growling, and that luckily stopped her from coming any closer. I got into the house, locked the door behind me, and I'm once again glad I have this dog with me. I don't know who she was or what she was up to, but the scariest part is that she was already probably stood there, crouched and waiting, when I got out. A few years ago, thanks to some corporate restructuring in my company, I found myself losing stable employment and picking up whatever seasonal jobs I could get for a few years until I got back on my feet. The only regular job I had during that time was driving a groomer at a large ski resort way up in the mountains. A friend of mine knew the operations manager there and was able to get me in, meaning that I did have a stable job from November to March every year, which took away some stress. On top of that, I actually really enjoyed my time there. Well, except for one night in particular. What a lot of people don't realize about ski hills is just how steep they really are. I know that seems obvious, especially on the double black diamond runs, but most people can comfortably ski or even walk on much steeper slopes than any vehicle can handle. You don't realize how difficult the terrain is until you try and get a 10-ton machine up there to try and groom it. For the really steep runs, we used what's called a winch cat. As you'd probably guess, it's a special snow cat with a winch mounted on top of that can spin 360 degrees around. You'd find a less steep route to the top of the mountain up one of the blue square or green circle runs, and then once you were at the top, there would be an anchor point that you could connect the winch cable to and then essentially rappel the machine down the ski slope to groom it. Once you were at the bottom, you'd winch yourself back up and repeat the process until the hill was finished, at which point you'd go back up, unhook the winch cable, and then drive back down the less steep runs. It's pretty scary going over the crest of the hill the first few times, but eventually you get used to the fact that you are attached to something that's stopping you from sliding down the hill, and you can turn off that part of the brain that tells you not to do it. The scariest hill of all to groom, though, was a run called Thunder. It was an extremely narrow double black diamond that pretty much went straight down and had a sharp bend at the bottom where you'd cut under the chairlift and rejoin the sane people skiing on a nice easy blue square run. It never took long to groom since it was only maybe 4 widths of the tiller wide, but to give you a picture how steep it was, you'd have to put your feet on the windshield to keep yourself in the seat when you were grooming downhill. One night when I was assigned the run the winch cat, I decided to get Thunder out of the way first since it's my least favorite run and I wanted to get it over with before I got tired. It was snowing hard that night, so it was slow going getting to the top since I couldn't see all that well, and when I did finally get up to the top of Thunder, it took me a solid 5 minutes of walking around outside to even find the winch anchor in the tree line. The first pass down went off without a hitch, and so did the first pass back up. However, it was slightly unnerving watching how much the 1-inch thick steel cable was swaying around in the wind. I took another pass down and turned around and started to ascend again and got about 3/4 of the way up the hill before the machine began to slip on an icy patch. I noticed the track starting to slip, so I gave the winch a bit more power, but it did nothing. The groomer stopped dead in its tracks, slowly spinning in place. I tried the winch again, but that didn't do anything. The cable also didn't seem to get any tighter, it just kept swinging around in the wind in front of me. I decided to back up and try again, so I slowly put the machine into reverse and let the cable take a bit of the strain before releasing it again. Just when the cable went tight, it felt like the whole machine had fallen out from underneath me and my brain didn't even process what was happening at first. This 10-ton tracked monster of a machine that's designed to climb the steepest of slopes was now sliding backwards down the hill incredibly quickly. When I finally came back to reality, I immediately remembered what they had said in training about getting turned around and using the blade as a handbrake. I mashed the track control levers in opposite directions, spinning it around to face downhill, and drove the front blade into the ground as hard as I could. I lost a track in the process since the sideways momentum of the machine in mid-spin derailed it from the idler wheels and it was sucked under and went into the tiller on the back. Putting the blade down didn't seem to slow my descent at all either and had only succeeded in bending several hydraulic cylinders, and now the tree line at the bottom of the hill before the turn was fast approaching. With only one track, I also didn't have a whole lot of steering capabilities either, so I accepted what was about to happen and just hoped the windshield would stay in one piece when it did. First, I went through a line of snow fence meant to keep skiers out of the trees. Then the blade hit a tree on the right-hand side and sent the machine spinning sideways into another much larger tree that brought the whole ride to a violent end and smashed out the driver's side window. Moments later, while I was still trying to process what had happened, there was another crash and the passenger side window smashed out. I figured the cable had all piled up against the machine or something since it had now finally occurred to me that the cable must have broken. I managed to climb out of the cab to assess the situation, and I was amazed I could even walk at that point. In fact, I was pretty much fine other than a few bruises. It wasn't until the next day when the snow had died down and I was able to go up on the snowmobile that I really got to see the extent of the damage. The snowcat was pretty much destroyed, and it had almost taken the tree it had hit down with it as well. The most shocking thing for me, though, was what had caused this whole thing in the first place. The cable wasn't broken at all. The large 8-inch metal pipe that the winch anchors to had somehow broken free of the concrete that it sunk into and ripped its way out of the ground. The second crash I had heard that night before was the pipe hitting the remains of my snowcat after flying down the hill behind me. Needless to say, after that experience, I spent the rest of the winter on the less steep runs where you don't need a winch cat, and after that season I decided that enough was enough, and that this job was a bit too extreme for me. Plus, the night shifts were starting to get to me anyways. Driving a snowcat is still something I'm proud to say I've done, and other than that, I did actually quite enjoy it. I know this isn't one of the usual horror stories that you're used to here, but I firmly believe that was the closest to death I had ever been, and it scared me more than I think any ghost encounter or creepy stalker would. I'm just grateful that I got out of that situation alive. Last night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from Universal Studios in Orlando. We were rerouted a way home we've never went before, and we're traveling in basically the middle of nowhere. My boyfriend's speedometer is broken in his car, and he has to press the button to reset the miles after he gets gas, and this will be very important soon. We were driving on a deserted road in the middle of absolute nowhere with not one car in sight. My boyfriend realized we hit the 130-mile mark on his odometer. We needed gas, but there was literally not one gas station in sight. I put search gas stations nearby, and we found one. It turned out to be closed. In a hurry, we found another gas station 5 minutes up the road, and this is where the story gets weird. My boyfriend thought that he closed his gas cap, and we were once again driving along this deserted road. We heard a loud bang, and he realized he forgot to put the gas cap back on, so we were driving around this dark road looking for the gas cap. He finally pulls over and realizes somehow the gas cap is still attached to the car. We get back on track to the other gas station. Out of nowhere, I had this horrible thought about something going wrong at that gas station. I pushed it aside because I knew we needed gas, and AAA is not an option where we were at the moment. We get to this gas station, the lights are kind of on. This road literally leads to a dead end, and with a gas station on it, the only way to leave this area was to turn left or go straight out of the gas station. My boyfriend got out of the car to see if we could get gas, and the feeling intensified. I have literally never felt like that in my life. My stomach dropping into my butt. I've been in very disturbing situations, such as almost being kidnapped twice, being followed home, watching someone being taken away in a body bag after being hit by a car, and even a paranormal situation. I can talk about these sometime in the future, but I had never felt like this before. I saw a white car pulling up the road to make a left. Keep in mind there is literally no one on this road. He pulls up and notices my boyfriend, and backs up with his windows down. I found this very strange because my boyfriend has a very nice sports car, and my mind immediately went into panic mode. I started screaming his name, and the man realized that someone else was in the car, myself, and turned left and sped off. Sadly, I didn't get his license plate because of how dark it was. This situation frightened me more than you can even imagine. It may not seem too scary, but it was easily one of the most terrifying things to watch because I didn't know if I was going to witness my boyfriend being robbed at gunpoint or something like that. The feeling and thought I had just 10 minutes earlier is what also made the situation even worse. I found a gas station with actual human life around, and we made it home safe and sound. Once I got home, my dad told me that the road we were driving on was famous for the many bodies being found on it. I hope no one ever gets put into the situation, and to the man who was planning to do something to my boyfriend, let's hope you never get away with it. When I was in kindergarten, we had a landline like every other household in the early 2000s. My mom made me memorize the phone number for obvious reasons, emergencies, etc. So I still clearly remember the phone number to this day, but obviously hadn't needed to use it since then. So here's the weird part about that. I was over at my mom's a few days ago, and we were telling all our stories of creepy happenings. It was fun and all, as I love this kind of stuff, but the vibe on the dark car ride home was all off. I got to my apartment and just felt weird, like something spooky was amiss. A few hours later, I'm sitting at my dining room table on my phone, and I noticed a missed call. I clicked to see who it's from, and lo and behold, my landline from kindergarten. I continued staring at it for a few minutes, completely puzzled, and called my mom to make sure it was the same number. Yep. She'd had the number since she was a kid, and it was the same one. I decided to call it back before assuming a ghost called me from my old phone, and a dial tone came back. My family no longer has this number, and I hadn't even thought of it in the last 16 years. It just bothers me that I didn't answer and will never know what I would have heard. It'll probably never happen again, either. Maybe the scary stories just had me freaking and it was all nothing. I just can't seem to think of a logical explanation for this. If anyone has any ideas, feel free to let me know. My house used to have strange occurrences on a somewhat regular basis. We had a bedroom that dogs and housekeepers would refuse to enter, and I had many terrifying experiences in this room. I'd be happy to share them later if anyone finds this post interesting. However, the strange experiences I had in my childhood home were not limited to that room alone. On this particular occurrence, I was home by myself in high school or late junior high, and I was in the living room at around 6 p.m. I have ADD, so I was reading and had the TV on and had both of our dogs in the living room with me. I made the habit of using all of these different stimuli and shutting all of the doors inside the house when I'm home alone because it eases my anxiety. The kitchen in my house is behind the living room, and when you're sitting on the couch facing our TV, you have to turn all the way around to see only the entrance to the kitchen as well as the back door. You can't see the inside of the kitchen from the living room hardly at all. So I was sitting and reading, and all of a sudden, I heard creaking from the floorboards in the kitchen, which always happens when someone is walking or moving around in our kitchen. I couldn't hear any footfalls, but it was unmistakably the sound of someone or something walking on the creaky, water-warped wood floors. Then, a cabinet door slammed. My dad always slammed cabinet doors and intentionally makes super loud noises in the kitchen in order to annoy us. I thought it was my dad, and maybe he had come home from work very early without me knowing. So without looking up from my book, I called out, "Dad? When'd you get home?" No one answered. A few seconds later, a couple more cabinet doors slammed, so I turned around on the couch to see the entrance to the kitchen and called out for my dad again. No answer. And then I heard repeated slamming of the cabinet doors over and over, extremely loud. They started to slam faster and faster, louder and louder. My pulse picked up and I could feel my heart beating in my ears. Suddenly the dogs stand up in the living room and faced the kitchen and started barking. I can see the hairs along their spines rising up, and despite the menacing nature of their growls, they actually looked scared. I started to panic and I quickly moved to the carpet to sit behind them in the living room, hoping that they would protect me, I suppose. I was facing the kitchen, my arms wrapped around both of my dogs' growling bodies. I was scared lifeless, and my heart was beating out of my chest. All of a sudden, the insanely loud slamming stops. For a while, all I could hear is the blood rushing in my ears and my own scared breathing. Then I hear the same creaking coming from the kitchen. The sound of something shifting its weight or walking started to move from the middle of the kitchen, where the sound originated, and towards the entrance to the living room. I was paralyzed in fear, unblinkingly staring at the source of the sound as it came closer and closer to entering my view. As the situation became quieter and more tense, the dogs suddenly stopped growling and started whimpering. They were shaking violently and their hair was raised all over. At this point, I'm essentially having a heart attack and preparing myself for the absolute worst. Then suddenly, my mom walks into the house through the door closest to the kitchen, arriving home from the grocery store. Everything stops. The creaking, the dogs, everything. My dogs started wagging their tails and went to greet my mom. I stayed sitting on the carpet of the living room, bewildered and adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Just to explain the situation and demonstrate that I'm not making something out of nothing, it couldn't have been sounds my mom made from coming into the house. The sounds were nothing like the dull, rapid thumps that came from a person walking along our back porch to enter the house. These sounds could have only come from the kitchen, specifically the floors and cabinets. I knew these sounds well as I grew up in this house. I tried to tell my mom what was happening right before she got home, but she didn't believe me or seem to care. I haven't told many people, but no one has ever believed this story. However, I can promise you that I know the house I grew up in well. I can also promise you that the fear and panic was very, very real. So it was the middle of the night in 1999. I was probably around 6 or 7. My brothers and I shared a room in our little duplex home. Now, just so everyone knows, even though these duplexes are old, I've lived in a few, and my family and I have never experienced anything paranormal in one before. So this is the only real time I've ever experienced anything that scared me like this. I woke up in the middle of the night sometime. I've always had trouble sleeping, so for me it was just another normal tossing and turning session late at night. Well, at least that was what I thought. As I laid in bed trying to get comfortable, I suddenly heard a child crying. This did not alarm me at first because, like I said, I shared a room with my 2 brothers. They are younger than me, and at times I would have to remind them that it was just a bad dream when they would wake up. But I looked down to the bottom bunk to check on them, and they were both sound asleep. I looked towards the hallway to see if there was a light coming from the living room. Nothing. Everyone in the house was asleep. Now I was scared. The voice was that of a child. The child's voice suddenly spoke through its tears. "Let me in, please." This scared me beyond all recognition at this point. It sounded like it was right there in the room with us. No one was making a sound. It was just a voice of a scared child begging through tears to let me in, please. And it went on for hours. I was so scared that I used my blanket as earmuffs to muffle the sound, and I eventually fell back asleep, but I never remember the voice stopping. After that, I slept with my blanket wrapped around my ears to block out sound, and eventually a fan as well, until I moved out of my parents' house at 16. So I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced anything similar or if anyone has their own theories, but I'm willing to hear them all in the comments because this was the scariest moment in my entire life. This experience took place 4 years later after my time at the all-boys school, and I was back in Boston. I was 20 years old, and I was gearing up to go off to college in another state. Before I left, I made it a priority to spend as much time with my friends before our respective journeys into college life drift us apart, as they always tend to do. A friend of mine invited all of us high school friends to a bonfire in Leominster, Massachusetts. For those of you who have never been to Leominster, it is basically the countryside of Massachusetts, where farming life and skiing resorts are plentiful. My friend, we'll call him Chase, family owned a plot of land out there in the countryside that has been in his family since the early 1920s. I was excited to go because I used to live out there when I was very young, about 5 years old, and haven't been out there since then. A few other friends, we'll call Kendrick, Sophie, Talia, and Kane, decided to carpool up there, since Talia's mom owned a minivan that she scored for us to travel in for that weekend. About 15 minutes away from our location, Kane asked Talia to pull over at a liquor store to buy some drinks. Keep in mind, some of us were only 18 to 20 years old, but Kane just turned 21, so obviously we stayed in the car while he went in to get the drinks. My excitement went up another level as, up until this point, I never had alcohol before and this would be my first time. After Kane returned with drinks, Talia drove us the rest of the way to Chase's place. When we arrived, it was just about sunset and Chase was standing outside waiting for us with his arms extended in the gesture of, "What took you guys so long?" Talia parked and we poured out of the van as Kane showed Chase the alcohol, and Chase's frustration quickly shifted to a smile as if all things were forgiven. Chase ushered us to the back of the home, saying that he had already started BBQing and food was practically done and getting cold. Later, as it was dark outside now and my friends and I were sitting around this bonfire, which was stacked with broken pieces of the family barn that was located a few yards from the actual house with hay used as kindling, laughing and carrying on about high school memories. I was on my second beer at this point, drinking slowly as I didn't want to get drunk, as this was my first time drinking and I was afraid that I'd pass out and miss the festivities, but I did have to pee. I announced I was going to take a leak. Chase reminded me to turn on the generator before heading in so you can turn on the lights since this place lacked electricity for some reason. I assured him that I would as I stood up, but a sudden head rush overtook me. I was buzzed as I stumbled back. Kane laughed and called me a lightweight, and the rest of my friends laughed. I gave Kane the finger as I turned and started toward the house. Right as I was in the middle of the bonfire in the house, I felt compelled to look over at the dark barn. I don't know why, but I did, and I studied it for a moment, and just as my eyes were completing its scan of the barn, my eyes instantly were fixed, and my jaw dropped as panic took over me. Through the orange glow of the bonfire, illuminated the barn partially. Standing in the doorway of the barn, there was someone standing there, staring at my friends, like this person was just glaring at them. At first, I thought it was one of my friends over at the barn just wanting to check it out, so I looked back at my friends to see which one of the guys was over there, but all 5 friends were standing around the fire having a good time. My eyes widened at this point, and I looked back over at the barn, and just when I did, the person who was once glaring at my friends was now glaring dead at me. He noticed I spotted him. I stood still in panic and shock as there was an intruder on my friend's property and I needed to inform the others so we can run and get to safety and phone the police. But I felt goosebumps radiating through my body as it did before a long time ago, forcing me to remember the silhouetted man from my school 4 years ago. This prompted me to fully study this intruder in case I needed to give a description to the police later, but when I did, I noticed the man was standing there, but his lower half was faded due to the glow of the bonfire, and his solid state was visible in the shadows. It was then that I realized what I was seeing. I mentally tried to calm myself as I fixed my eyes on this ghost, who had not broken his glare at me. I muscled up the courage somehow to glare right back at him. I was now locked in a stare down with this figure for what seemed like minutes, but it was more like a few seconds. Just then I heard Sophie yell, "Hey, did you pee yourself or something?" Her words pierced my ears as I heard my friends laughing and asking why I was just standing there, but my eyes never broke from this figure. Just then I felt a sudden burst of anger take over me like a fiery wave as I was flung into the inferno of our bonfire. I felt sweat beating down my cheeks as I glared at this ghost who was glaring back at me. Just then the ghost sort of smirked at me as if he was taunting me. This enraged me even further as I could hear footsteps approaching from behind me. It was Kendrick coming to check up on me as I heard him say, "Dude, what's up?" Just as Kendrick asked that, I bolted. I charged towards the ghost as if we were about to go to war. The ghost stood for a few seconds, never breaking his glare on me. I felt my heart beating against my chest as each step I took, I became hotter and hotter. I felt like I was a man on fire. As soon as I was a yard or two away from this ghost, he stepped into the barn out of sight. "Get back here," I remember shouting. I got to the barn doorway where the ghost stood and flung the door open and stood there expecting to see him waiting for me, but nothing. I was staring into pure darkness of the barn. I remember my heart beating hard against my chest. My sweat-drenched shirt clung to my body, heavy breathing ready as adrenaline coursed my body as I was ready for a fight that would never come. The next thing I knew, Kendrick, Kane, and Chase ran up to me and grabbed my arm, knocking me out of my daze. My body instantly felt normal, so I no longer felt like I was on fire. Completely confused, I didn't know what came over me. I never felt such anger before, as I am known for my buds as being a very chill guy, but I was truly ready to rip this ghost guy's head off of his body, or lack thereof. My friends figured that I must have been drunk or high on something to rationalize why I acted like that. They began escorting me back towards our bonfire, where Sophie and Talia were sitting, looking at me with concerned eyes. Still trying to rationalize what I have just done as my friends guided me away, I turned my head to look at the barn's door, which was still wide open once more, and I kid you not, deep into the dark barn, I saw him. More specifically, I saw his floating head, as his eyes were staring straight at me with a devilish grin. Nobody, just his head. I turned and faced frontwards as we neared the bonfire, and my friends began to calm me down. Sophie spoke up and asked what happened. I remember saying nothing, as I didn't want to appear to be crazier than I just made myself out to be. I still had to go take a leak, but I figured that I would just hold it until we all went back inside together to prevent myself from acting out like that again. We did eventually return back into the house. I took my leak and ended up passing out on the couch. As far-fetched as this story must sound, trust me, I know it does, but it really happened to me. The fact that I was ready to go to blows with a spirit, absolutely insane. Kane eventually confessed to me a few months ago, yeah, we do keep in touch, that I must have taken his LSD blended drink, as we were drinking the same brand of bottled beer and we were just putting it down randomly and picking up on what we thought was our own beer. He knew that must have been the case because he didn't feel the effects of the drink that entire night, but when he saw me act like that, he figured that was the reason why. I honestly don't know if I was drunk or tripping off my friend's LSD, but I truly felt that there was a ghost in that barn, taunting me, angry that Chase took pieces of his barn to burn in our bonfire that was his way of getting back at us. That was my assumption, of course. I have a few more encounters that I would share in time, but this one still gets to me. This incident took place about 40 years ago, a few months after my grandfather, my mom's dad, passing. Here in Sri Lanka, we give alms on the day that marks 7 days and the subsequently 3 months, and then yearly after a person's passing, as a way to add merit to their account, so to speak, with hopes that they'll pass on to the afterlife and have a peaceful one from thereafter. This is done regardless of religion, but mainly practiced by the Buddhist. So, this was the day of my grandfather's 3 months alms giving, and my mom, her eldest sister, and youngest brother out of the family of 7 children, along with my grandmother, decided to give lunch to the less fortunate and hunger, and then visit their father's grave in the evening to pay their respects. Everything went as planned for lunch, and then in the evening, as they all got into my father's car to leave my mother's eldest sister's house to head to the cemetery, the car just wouldn't start up. So my uncle and dad got out as the ladies remained in the car. They popped the hood and took a look at it, and then my dad got back in and gave it a go, and the car started up just fine. So my uncle closed the hood and got back in, but as soon as he shut the door, the car died again. Since it didn't seem to be any clear engine trouble, my uncle got back out, called upon a few guys in the neighborhood to give the car a bit of a push, and the car started, but as before, as soon as my uncle got in the car, it died again. This repeated twice more, and everyone felt odd because the car that gave no trouble all day was suddenly acting strange, supernatural, even if you will. Finally, my uncle gave the car a third push and told the others to go ahead without him, that he'll come on his own, and all agreed. So as my dad, mom, and mom's eldest sis and grandma drove to the cemetery still feeling odd, and as they took their turn towards the cemetery, the car suddenly went very cold, and right side car door, where my mom's sis sat, flew open, and my mom's sis screamed as if though she was in unbearable pain, suddenly while grabbing my mom, who sat next to her, and the car came to a sudden stop. Everyone was shaken up, my mom's sis mostly, and as everyone took a sec to gather themselves, my mom's sis screamed again, holding her right knee in pain. It was bleeding, and there were 3 distinct claw marks that clearly were fresh. They got her cleaned up with a bit of running tap water at the moment and tied a handkerchief to stop the bleeding and continued with their planned evening events. After they got out, they all tried to figure out what had just happened, and all agreed that the car not starting up, the incident that happened at the cemetery turn, and the scratches were all connected, and that they were surely something very evil, and for some unknown reason it didn't want my uncle riding with them in the car, and because my mom's sis is kind of a magnet for the paranormal, it chose her to hurt and send a message. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.